Hello everyone, this is Collapsed. So what is Collapsed? Well, it's sort of, it's a roguelite, and as you probably know by watching this channel at all, I really enjoy covering any game in that genre because it's fun for me. But this game actually has some differences that make it a little bit more like a sort of 2D ARPG than anything else, and that's a lot of that's down to the itemization and the way that the progression works, but it is ostensibly a roguelite, meaning you're going to be going on individual runs where eventually you will die and go back to your sort of hub area that's safe, mess around with your build a little bit, store some items, try some new stuff, and go back again on a new run. And the game does have a couple of methods, sort of like meta progression, as games like this tend to have, but in this case they work a little bit differently. So one of the main methods in the game is your gear, because of course in sort of like action RPG style, as you kill enemies and open chests and like, they will drop gear of various rarities that you can use. And it works in a way that they're sort of like supplements to the character's actual gear, because there are 4 characters in the game and each of them have a melee weapon, a piece of armor, and a ranged weapon of some sort. And the actual gear that you get is basically stuff that attaches onto these 3 things rather than actually replacements for these 3 things that sort of augment their power in some way. And each piece of gear has 3 different slots, so you can have 9 total pieces of different stuff attached to you, as well as 2 active abilities that you can use. And you can switch between any of these things at any given time. You have a limited but pretty sizable inventory, as well as a stash back at home that you can put stuff in, and that's where the sort of first interesting difference of this game comes in. When you die, although it is technically sort of permadeath, as in, you will end the run at that point and go back to your hub, you don't actually lose what you're carrying, which is very unusual for a roguelite style of game. Generally speaking, runs are sort of self-contained adventures, and the only way to actually affect them in a more meta way is whatever sort of progression system the game has in it, usually some sort of like unlocking new items or something like that. But in this case, you actually keep everything that you're carrying. Both stuff that in your actual loose inventory and stuff that you have equipped stays with you when you die, and that's why there's a stash at home, so you can go back home and put any sort of stuff that you want to in there for later usage. Also because there are 4 save slots, and there are 4 characters, as I mentioned, so each save slot can have a character, but they aren't exactly separate save slots, as you might think, because every upgrade that you obtain on one character, as well as whatever you put in your stash on that character, is actually present for all other characters. So they're kind of like 4 segments of one big save slot, is a good way to think of them. It's basically just like a somewhat contrived method of character selection, effectively. And each of these characters does have a couple of different passive abilities that affects how they play a bit, as well as, like I mentioned, their own selection of a range and a melee weapon. And they each work quite differently, which means that every item that you get also could apply to them a bit differently. You might get an item that adds a projectile to each shot of their ranged weapon. Well, the character with the sort of Gauss sniper rifle versus the character with the shotgun are both going to sort of react to that particular add-on a bit differently, and therefore it's kind of useful to keep a stash of different items that you think may be useful for different characters or may be fun to try out with them. That's kind of a big part of the game, is actually coming up with an effective build that's specific to that character and the things that they can do and what they're sort of meant for, since each one does actually play quite a bit differently. The other system of meta progression is more like the sort of traditional progression of a roguelite like this, like, say Enter the Gungeon or something like that, where you have a sort of meta currency that you get from killing bosses or finding it rarely in levels, and then you can use it to get new stuff. And that's how this works, with another bit of a twist on it. So it's basically just a giant skill tree, a pretty large skill tree, very sizable, that has a lot of different options, and you start at the very top middle of it and kind of branch downwards. Somewhat unusual for a tree. And it takes 3 different currencies, and that's one thing the game doesn't really tell you, is what these 3 currencies are. I mean, they have names, but the tutorial doesn't really go into them. It doesn't go into why you need all 3 of them, like, which kinds of upgrades take more of which one, and also if there are different, better ways to get individual ones than others. But as is usual for games like this, killing bosses is kind of the main way to actually obtain these. And you can spend them in different amounts of each one, depending on what sort of upgrade you're getting in the skill tree for various things. And they are mostly either upgrades for your character or new items that you can find in runs after that. And when you buy a new item, or unlock a new item rather, it's actually kind of like getting multiple versions of that item, since this game does use a color-based rarity system, which means you can find that same item in several different rarities with extra abilities attached to it. So buying an item is kind of like getting, 4 or 5 different versions of it, because they can have different stats and things attached to them depending on what they roll when they drop. And interestingly enough, the actual character upgrades, which range from everything from sacrificing some health to get better attack power for melee and ranged weapons, or upping your flask capacity, which is what you use for healing, or various things like that, they actually have to be equipped. Your characters have 4 open slots to equip these various upgrades when they start the game, so you can choose 4 of them to equip and sort of mix and match depending on what build you're going for or what character you're playing. And there are 4 more slots for a total of 8 that you can unlock as you go through the tree by paying different currencies to actually get access to them. So you can actually make your character quite powerful with 8 of these various upgrades sort of stacking together to alter their stats. And this also is very dependent on the different character that you're playing, because, the one that, for instance, gives you extra magazine capacity may not be something that you want to devote a quarter of your total, progression stats to when you only have 4 slots. If you're, for instance, the character in the background with 100 round capacity assault rifle. However, if you're the character with a 25 round capacity Gauss sniper rifle type of weapon, then it could be more worth of the slot, basically. So these can be changed just like your equipment whenever you want when you're home for any character, and you can change your equipment, of course, whenever, even in a normal run. And the game does use a sort of switching focus kind of a system, as in, you can't really do pure melee or pure ranged combat. Generally speaking, you have to kind of switch between the two, and that's mostly because, as I mentioned, there is an ammo system, so obviously you can't constantly use your ranged weapons because eventually you will run out of ammo, but you don't always want to use your melee weapon either, because there might be some things that you just really don't want to get close to you. And each class will generally have a different sort of function that restores their ammo based on their melee attacks. It works a bit differently for each one, but generally speaking, that's one of the best ways to actually get more ammo, is to actually kill things with melee. And there are also ammo drops that you can find that will increase how much you're holding. So it's kind of a system that's based between dashing around. You do have a dash that gives you immunity frames and can be repeated quite often, so it makes you pretty mobile and quick. And just sort of dashing around these large areas of enemies and trying to get rid of them in the most effective, efficient way possible, targeting the really dangerous ones at range and killing hordes of smaller ones with melee attacks to keep your ammo up. It makes for a pretty frantic and pretty enjoyable combat system. I do find the controls a bit stiff. However, that is being addressed very soon, and I'll go into a bit more detail about that later, but for the most part, the game actually does control and play quite well. The enemy variety is also really, really good. That's a very important point for a game like this. There usually needs to be quite a bit of variety in the things that you're taking down to keep it interesting and satisfying, and there definitely is. There are several different sort of tile sets of areas that you'll go through. I think there are 9 different ones, and the different areas will have different sorts of hazards, as well as different types of enemies around them, as well as these weird shadow enemies that show up sometimes that are really, really strong in comparison to their normal variants. And so that does help to keep the combat more interesting, since you will be destroying lots of things along the way. There is also a sort of melee stunning system where different enemies have a different value of these orbs below their health gauge, which represent melee hits that will, if depleted completely in time, stun them, which you can use to help take care of larger, more threatening enemies a little bit more safely with melee. And different characters are differently equipped to actually handle different enemies in melee. The character I'm showing you right now has this big scythe that does these 360-degree sweeping attacks that are really good in midair and really good at hitting enemies behind them as well as in front of them, so that's very much like an AoE focus. Whereas the other character that I'm about to show you has a spear, which is of course very narrow forward strikes that do pierce quite far. So the sort of situations in which you're going to be using your melee and the different ways that you want to sort of navigate in order to effectively use your melee attack, it changes depending on who you're playing, which is always interesting because it makes the playstyles that much more different, which is kind of what you want in a game like this. The bosses are definitely a really good point. They're, in my opinion, one of the basically where the game kind of shines the most. The boss fights are pretty interesting and pretty well designed. They have lots of different sorts of telegraphed attacks to go through, lots of, summoning animations and projectile attacks and all the stuff that you want to sort of be able to keep an eye on a boss to sort of increase the skill ceiling of it, to make sure that you're paying attention during the boss fight and you're, dodging and avoiding and stuff and not just standing there and shooting, basically. The bosses are pretty interesting as a result of all that, so they also do get quite challenging. The game is, I wouldn't say the game is incredibly hard, but it's not easy either, and as you get later in the levels and you have to explore more and more, and enemies get tougher and more varied and stuff like that. There's like champion enemies and there's shadow enemies I mentioned. It does get quite hectic, and there can be quite a lot of projectiles and stuff on screen at once, with the different enemies creating all sorts of different patterns for each one, which is enjoyable for me. I like that sort of thing. You also have the aforementioned flask, where you can hold a button to heal yourself, which you cannot attack while you're doing this, but you can still move around. So it's, I suppose, a bit like a sort of Souls-like healing system, where you have to be careful when you use it and kind of gather it to be used at the appropriate time to keep yourself healthy. It's that sort of system. Overall, I think it plays really well because of all this sort of coming together to make a pretty enjoyable whole. And if you like the sort of roguelite 2D roguelites like this, like say Dead Cells, then this is probably up your alley. I wouldn't say that it's quite as polished or as like satisfying in melee as Dead Cells is, but it still is a pretty good game in its own right, and it definitely has its own identity. It doesn't feel like it's trying to ape the success of games like that at all. It actually does do its own thing, which is good to see. Now, I did mention the controls earlier, so there is sort of a bit of a problem with control stiffness in the game right now, where sometimes it feels like you're not in full control of your character because of a lack of certain kind of expected features. Mainly an input queue or some sort of canceling mechanic, where, in a lot of games like this, 3D and 2D, where you're expected to move around a lot and be dodging and attacking and stuff in sort of like quick succession, they will have an input queuing system where if you sort of input some sort of command a few frames before your character can actually do it, it will queue that command so that when those frames pass and your character can now do whatever you said, they will actually do it automatically without you having to push the button again. And this is to make the character feel a bit more responsive, as well as eliminate things like dropped commands, which is, where you press a button and nothing happens because your character couldn't actually do that yet. But this game doesn't seem to have any sort of input queuing system at all, which does lead to the feeling of dropped commands sometimes, where especially when things get really hectic and you're trying to dodge and aim and attack quite quickly in succession, some of these commands don't seem to go off because you just hit them at a time when your character couldn't actually perform them, and it isn't queued, so it just gets dropped. And there's also no canceling system right now, so you can't, for instance, cancel out of a melee attack animation early in order to dodge. That also leads to a bit of a feeling of stiffness or unresponsiveness, because it feels like no matter how fast your brain is responding to the action and how fast you're inputting commands to deal with what's going on, your character can only move at a certain speed, and it feels a bit more limiting than it should. However, that is all being solved, or it's supposed to be solved soon, and I'm glad I actually kind of waited to put this video out so that they announced this, because I didn't know about it until yesterday. They're actually going to update some of the sort of control mechanics of the game to actually add a canceling system, so you can actually do some animation canceling, and that will help to make your character feel a lot more responsive as a result. I hope it should really help with that issue a lot and kind of alleviate a lot of the stiffness that the controls have right now. And also they're going to change the melee system to where when you aim with the cursor, you have a cursor for melee attacks, or for ranged attacks, sorry, but normally it doesn't really affect melee attacks except for whatever side it's on. So if you're facing forward, but your cursor is behind you, when you press the melee attack button, you will attack behind you. But the actual height and specific direction of the aiming cursor does not actually change your melee attack. They are altering that now to where the melee attack will actually follow the direction of the cursor, so you can, jump over an enemy and hit them from above, or attack things above you by attacking directly above you instead of jumping and stuff like that. So that should also help to alleviate some of the stiffness of the controls, making the melee system feel that bit more satisfying, which is a really good idea, and I'm glad they're doing it. Like I said, I'm glad I waited for that sort of announcement to actually make this video, because those are some of the biggest problems I personally had during my experience playing the game, and seeing that they are actually aware of this and they're going to address it is really nice, for sure. But overall, I think Collapsed is a pretty good game. It has an interesting mix of like progression systems and some fun characters to play that respond to the items in different ways, which makes it actually satisfying to try and build them in different ways with all these various different types of projectiles and elemental attacks and all these other upgrades for you to find. So it is satisfying to play, for sure, and if you are interested in roguelites, it is a good one. It doesn't really have any like glaring design problems, in my opinion. It just has a couple of little control bits that they are actually going to fix. So that is Collapsed. It is available right now in the Steam page linked below this video for $15, although at the time of recording until the 8th of August, I believe, it is available for 10% off. So if you want to get in on it, then try it out. That has been Collapsed. Thank you guys very much for watching. If you like this video, feel free to hit the like button. If you did not, feel free to dislike it and tell me why. And yeah, that's that. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.